Hello, my friends. I am Rachel Archelaus. You are listening to the Multidimensional Human Podcast, and today I am already riled up, which you may not be able to tell because I'm autistic. And sometimes, even when I feel like bubbling with excitement on the inside, it still doesn't look like I'm that excited. So, that is the theme for today. Not that flat affect, but why I'm so glad to know that I'm autistic, neurodivergent in general, and why it might be beneficial for you or your child to know that they are neurodivergent and what specifically autistic, ADHD, whatever else, OCD, Tourette's, like there's a lot that falls under the neurodivergent header, and we're going to talk about why maybe you prefer the term neurodivergent over autistic or ADHD. What are the pros and cons of knowing? And I'm saying specifically not getting diagnosed because I don't feel like most people need a formal diagnosis. There are lots of other ways to identify whether you are neurodivergent, and it may or may not make sense for you to get a formal diagnosis. Also, we're going to talk about the broader autistic phenotype, which is like a subclinical version of autism. So it's not maybe impairing your life to the degree that you'd get a formal psychological diagnosis, but the traits are present enough that it is who you are. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I was like as a kid and what not knowing perhaps caused me, and then why I do prefer to know that I'm autistic now, and talk you through a little bit of that because I feel like this is a very common story of late diagnosed autistic people. And I guess we need to get it out of the way first. Autism is not a it's not a problem. It's not something that's wrong with you. There is a lot of stigma. There always has been, but there's a lot right now. No, Tylenol did not make you autistic. You did not make your child autistic by taking acetaminophen. That has been thoroughly disproved. And in fact, it's dangerous to not treat your pain, your fever, with acetaminophen while you're pregnant. More dangerous, in fact, than not taking it. So you probably already know that, but I just had to say it. Autism has come a long way. It's changed a lot in the DSM. Originally, autism and the diagnosis criteria was based on pretty affluent young white males. And so what is currently used, the ADOS, is still basically the same. They've broadened the diagnostic criteria a bit and changed it. There used to be like separate like sub-diagnosis, the Asperger's, which was even more problematic. That is no longer in there. So if you hear people say, oh, it's just Asperger's, it's kind of like the less severe form of autism, but that doesn't exist anymore. It's ASD, autism spectrum disorder. They've also updated things where previously you were not allowed to have a diagnosis of autism and ADHD, but now you can, and in fact, it's quite prevalent. Yeah, there's a lot of overlap now. It's not that there's an overlap now, it's that they are recognizing the overlap now. So what I'm trying to say is that even getting a diagnosis is very tricky for certain kinds of people. Unless you are the stereotypical young boy or you present as that, it is difficult to get an autism diagnosis. And I think what a lot of people imagine when they think of an autistic child is the very high support needs, maybe an intellectual disability, maybe a lot of self-harm in their stimming, And that's just a very small percentage of what autism can look like. There, and it's not a spectrum as in like 0 degrees to 100 degrees in severity. It's a spectrum in like, okay, here is all of the traits of autism, and then you have these 7, or they have these 6, and they're just different traits dialed up or down singularly, right? You have a chart, and your chart is going to look different. It's not a 0 to 100, it's just different. And that is what also makes it very difficult to clue into personally and professionally. You know, it's a really rapidly changing field of study. This neurodivergence is pretty new, and there aren't a ton of people studying it. So there are a lot of clinicians that just haven't kept up to date with the changes. There are a lot of clinicians who are unaware of what autism can look like in anyone other than a young male. And unless you're specifically looking for it, it's really hard to see. And so, like general practitioners, I guess you'd be like a pediatrician, they're not necessarily going to be a good resource for you if you're looking for a diagnosis for your kid, or your GP for you, or even your therapist. Although your therapist might know more than the psychiatrist that you would go to get a diagnosis, or the psychologist. So that is what makes this so tricky. And that is what makes self-diagnosis so valid in this way of, are you autistic, are you ADHD specifically? Because it's a lot less cut and dry. It's very internal. A lot of females, a lot of like people who are queer are very internalized in their neurodivergence. They're masking a lot. They've learned how to cope with the world and to present the best possible face they can and fake it till they make it. And that makes it really hard to tell in a diagnostic setting, because if you're faking it till you make it and you don't know that, you're masking, you don't know that you're smiling because you were taught to smile, it's really difficult to pin down. And so you might get like, oh no, this person isn't autistic. And I've heard all the stories. I've heard that someone has been told they can't possibly be autistic because they held eye contact. They can't possibly be autistic because they have friends. They can't possibly be autistic because they got, they made it through school, whatever. So depending on medical professionals for a diagnosis can be tricky. It can be very tricky. And you would really want to do your research ahead of time to go to someone that you know is capable of diagnosing your kind of person, whether you are, adult, kid, male, female, queer, not queer, like whatever it is that you are, you want to make sure that other people have had a good experience with that clinician. And it's out there, but it does take a lot of work, which is why doing a lot of the research yourself can really help you and at least know I'm most likely yes, or I'm most likely not. And another reason that self-diagnosis is valid is because if you think you're autistic, if you get, you go through the assessments online that you can do, you read a bunch about it, you understand what your traits would be, how you would stack up to the diagnostic criteria, and you get a good sense of I resonate with this or I don't resonate with this, and you think, yes, this is me completely, 100%, or 90%, 80%. And then you start treating yourself like you're autistic, you're ADHD, and using the coping mechanisms, the tools, the resources that that person would use, and you find it to be helpful, well, that's amazing, right? What could go wrong if you do that? We're going to talk about some of the cons of getting diagnosed. So it's not like no harm could come, but it's so minimal compared to how much you could help yourself. One of the biggest reasons that I'm so passionate about people understanding if they're on the spectrum or not, and I'm including ADHD in this, so I might not say that every single time, but know that that's the truth, and other forms of neurodivergence as well, is that when you don't know it, you don't understand why you're different from other people, then it can cause this internalized shame of like, why am I so different? Why can't I do it their way? Why is everything so hard for me? Why am I so sensitive? Why blah blah blah? And that definitely uh, happened a lot in my youth. The biggest thing that I think still stays with me today happened from an adult. And so, yes, kids treated me differently. Yes, I was bullied. Yes, I was othered. Yes, a lot of stuff like that. But I also had friends. I also had um, interests. Like, I didn't feel necessarily devastated as a kid. I had some self esteem, which was good. But I do remember having some hard times at school and going to the nurse's office pretty frequently. I said I had a stomach ache, and I don't remember how that felt. So I don't know if I just had anxiety, if I had a stomach ache that was like different from that. But I went there pretty frequently, and I remember the nurse once saying like why haven't you been tested? And at that point, I didn't know what that meant, but it felt biting. It felt like, what's wrong with this kid? Like, why haven't they figured out what's wrong with this kid? And that was really hurtful to me because it was coming from an adult that I was supposed to be able to trust. And especially in today's world, autism is really seen as this thing that's tearing apart families. And if an adult other than the parents of the kid, are identifying this thing in the kid first and they're not cool with it, then I think that is like a weapon. Like imagine, I don't know what the metaphor would be, but like if you get ahead of it, then it loses its power from other people. And I think that is really what I'm hoping self-diagnosis or formal diagnosis can do. It's like, okay, well, you think I'm weird because of whatever stereotype, you know but I know I'm different. I'm not weird, I'm different. And different can be exceptional, different can be incredible. There are a lot of advantages to being neurodivergent. And if you can understand the hardships and the challenges and really have strategies to deal with that, then you can lean into the great parts of it much more easily and without all the shame. So I definitely felt stifled as a kid when it came to being my full self because of some autistic traits like repeating what somebody else was saying, tapping, stimming, needing to take more time to understand things and reply. And of course, and none of this was clocked. Like, I didn't really know what was going on. I just knew that like people were giving me weird looks or telling me I was doing something strange. And so I just stopped doing it. And that's not optimal. We should be empowering ourselves and our children to be who they are, even when it is different. And if, especially with like things, we stim for a reason. We stim to move the energy out of our bodies. We stim to help us process what's going on and all the information that we're taking in. Like, there's reasons why we do all these things. And we're not even going to talk about ABA therapy, which can be very controversial. Obviously, if you have a child who's self-harming, then you want all the resources you can to help with that. But using behavioral therapy to just get the autism out of them is not a helpful thing, even if it makes them appear more normal, right? So we need to get over the fact that we need to be neurotypical and just accept the fact that we are neurodivergent and that there's a lot of great stuff that can come with that if we can work with ourselves. If we didn't have neurodivergent people, autistic people, the world would not have as many innovations as it has, and we'd be probably living in the Stone Age. So let's not forget that, like, we need all kinds of people in this world, and we can all coexist, but it does help if you're empowered and if you know who you are, which I think is important. So if I had known, and if my school had known that I was autistic, maybe I wouldn't have received any better care or thoughtfulness there. But it's possible that I could have had more empathy shown to me, right? We could have understood that I could use some accommodations, right? Maybe if I was feeling overstimulated in class and that's why I was getting like anxiety or, a tummy ache, then they could have just a quiet seat for me somewhere else, right? If I go to the nurse, they don't need to know that I am sick. They could just be like, oh, there's your little chair, you go sit down, or whatever it could be. Go color for 5 minutes and then go back to class. There are ways to help children in class and in life that you might not know about exist unless there is a diagnosis. So getting older, I've briefly mentioned this, I'll just briefly mention it again. I was finding myself very intelligent, very capable, but experienced a pretty big shutdown in my late teen years, which I didn't really recover from very quickly and left me with very little upward mobility. Just finding the lowest of the low jobs and not really performing to my capability. And that is where a lot of neurodivergent people find themselves. And that is something, again, that if we know we are autistic, ADHD, whatever, and we know that we're going to be stigmatized, we're going to tend to need more mental health care, we're going to need more structure in our lives. Like, if we know how to set up our lives and how to take care of ourselves in the best way possible, then we can give ourselves the chance of not falling into the trap of being underemployed or homeless or clinical depression, right? Like, there's a lot of ways that we can sort of fall through the cracks. And if we know how to take care of ourselves and that that's a possibility, then we can steer clear of that as best we can, or set up care so that if that does happen, we're not destitute. So yes, we may need to think a bit more about how we live our lives and how to safeguard ourselves from things like that. But at least if we know, we know. If we don't know, then we're just in that situation and it can feel very shameful. I know I had a lot of thoughts of I remember being in high school in the art program that I was in, learning about art therapy and thinking, oh yeah, I could definitely do that. That sounds so much fun. Wanting to go to the Institute of Art in Chicago and just kind of seeing a pathway. Like, most of my peers knew, here, mostly what they wanted to do with their lives, what they wanted to major in, or that they wanted to go to a certain college. And because autism is highly heritable, if you are autistic, your parents were most likely autistic. And if they didn't find their footing, in life, their solid foundation, if they're not going to be able to help you pay for college or whatever, then your chances are even less likely to do that right off the bat, right? So there is a cycle here. And one of the ways we can find a better future for ourselves is to break the cycle of not knowing so that we can take better care of ourselves moving forward. I have amazing parents, but like, you know, could it have been a little bit different if I knew I was autistic and I knew that getting to that college, getting into a program could have been easier having known certain things about myself? That would have been great. So I didn't go to that college. I didn't go to any college. I dropped out of high school. I got married and I went to community college, which was great. But I worked a lot of just really menial jobs in the meantime. And I didn't really get a solid footing until I had a partner who knew how to live in this world. Um, I did okay. I was happy as I could be. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't a devastating thing. I wasn't homeless or anything. I had a lot of love in my life, a lot of support, but I wasn't able to find a way to really take hold, to like Velcro into life and be on one plan. That wasn't available to me in my understanding of my brain and how I worked. I had like 40 jobs until I stopped having jobs and worked for myself. So that's a lot. That's a lot of jobs. And I was loved by my employers. My employers loved me. I was smart and capable and productive and all the things. So it has nothing to do with that. It's just there's a lot of other things going on when you're neurodivergent. That is only one story, right? Everybody has a different story. Some people do just fine, some people don't. And it's not like a diagnosis is ultimately going to change all of that. It's just a great way to learn more about yourself and your needs and how to fill those needs so that you have the best chance of success. That's what I love about this. And to eradicate the shame of, why can't I do this? Why am I not normal? Why is it so easy for everybody else? Why is this so hard for me? I don't understand. Why can't I just be happy? Why can't I just do it? Why can't I just buck up? And you know what I mean? So if that kind of stuff is roiling around in your head, then maybe look into, how do I get to know myself better? Am I neurodivergent? What kind of neurodivergent? How can I support myself better? What research is out there? What are the resources? What is what is an easy way forward? And I do offer those sessions. I offer coaching sessions and I offer sensory support sessions. So you can go to archelaus.com and check all of that out. I also have the Institute for Multidimensional Living, which has a workshop, a meditation, and a Q&A each month to help neurodivergent and other people thrive as you are, right? So just because we're neurodivergent doesn't mean we can't thrive, doesn't mean we can't have the most amazing, epic, incredible, successful lives just like anybody else. It's just that we might require a bit more self-care, a bit more self-understanding. Research shows post-diagnosis, adults experience greater self-acceptance and reduced self-blame. And if you think about the energy it takes to self-blame, right? The heaviness of self-blame. When you can release some of that, you are freer. You are more energetic. You have more resources to put toward what you actually want to do instead of blaming yourself for what you can't do, which, let me tell you, is a real game changer. There's also this thing that can happen where you start to say, nothing's wrong with me. My brain just works differently. That's the key, right? Your brain just works differently. There is nothing wrong with you. And there's a great book called We're Not Broken, which I highly recommend if you're finding yourself in this sort of like questioning or newly diagnosed space. So if you want formal accommodations at school, at work, or even, it's not a formal accommodation, but at home with your partner, if you want more understanding for needing alone time, for needing certain schedule with childcare and all of that, then a diagnosis can really do that for you. So don't overlook that. There's also ways that insurance can cover therapy and other things that you might not get otherwise if you didn't have a diagnosis. The identity part can be another really helpful thing. So I'm not really a group person, But if I was going to go to, let's say, a networking event or group therapy or group events, would I rather choose one that I know specifically is for neurodivergent people? Yes. Yes, I would. Because if you are neurodivergent and don't know, then you might be accustomed to being judged, to being looked at like you're weird, to feel like you're not able to have conversations with people in the way they're expecting. And if you're in a neurodivergent space, a lot of that pressure is off. You could just be yourself because they get it too. And we've talked about the strategies that you can use if you know you're neurodivergent. You can look up ways neurodivergent people can do blah, 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 right? Planning, scheduling, going to see doctors, scripts for all kinds of things that you're anxious about, how to handle this or that. I think it can be very helpful to have a word to use to search for, right? Because if not, you don't know what you're looking for. And I think that in that way, and you can also have some identity pride too, right? Like you're part of this group now and you don't need to feel alone anymore, which is very helpful. There's also, of course, always some cons. And I think the biggest con at this very moment is if you carry some of that stigma that neurodivergent or autistic or ADHD, like you're broken, you're weird, you're an abomination, you're gonna have to sort of feel your way out of that. You know, like if you take on that identity and you have a negative association with it, it can take a minute to get over that, you know? It's not like I found out I was autistic and then I was jumping for joy the next day. Like it was a ride. It was a ride because I had a lot of like, can I still do this? Or I kind of felt like I was like this magical unicorn floating through space and this weird alien being who just a lot of good things happened to, but I was also like not able to really connect with this planet. And learning that I wasn't some magical being, that I was just autistic was like, oh, that's kind of a letdown at first. But then, of course, I realized all of the amazing things that came with just understanding who I really am, which, of course, I'm still a magical being, but I'm also these other things. It can be super duper freaking expensive, super expensive to get a diagnosis, like thousands of dollars. And you can even have a terrible experience after paying all of that. And it can take days. Like a formal autism diagnosis, especially for an adult, like they're talking to your family, they're getting written reports of when you were a kid. Like it is a big deep dive because it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. They need to know that it was present when you were little. And so there's a lot that has to happen. And it can be very expensive, very time consuming, very taxing. Being interviewed can be very triggering for people. It might not be worth it if you already are pretty clear that you're autistic. You can also become over identified and like sort of use it as a crutch and sort of count yourself out because of what a lot of people are saying about autism. Or if you are diagnosed like level 2, level 3, and you need care and, you know, more resources, you can sort of take on a lot of the weight of that instead of being freed by it. And so you really should know yourself and also seek therapy if you think you are autistic but you're not okay with it, or you need more support than you're getting right now, you don't know how to get it. Like reach out to people and talk it through. There's a lot of, I actually just did a post here about what kind of therapy works better for neurodivergent people where CBT may not, and that's like what is typical right now. So it can be so hard to research all this because you don't know, perhaps. Like maybe you don't know that different therapists use different modalities, you know, but trial and error. And, you know, I can hopefully be a resource for you. So reach out if you have any questions. And again, this like post-diagnosis vacuum of like, okay, I'm autistic, now what? Now what do I do? We're Not Broken. Unmasking is a good book too. Mom on the Spectrum YouTube channel is really good. But also finding a neurodivergent affirming therapist can be excellent. And especially if you've gotten a diagnosis, then hopefully you can get some insurance coverage for that too. We're going to talk about kids in a minute, but first I want to talk about the broader autism phenotype. The broader autism phenotype addresses people who are subclinical or quote unquote milder forms of ASD. So maybe it's not so disruptive to your life. Maybe you're already like super duper thriving and you just really resonate with a lot of the traits of ASD. Then you could have the broader autism phenotype, which is just like a subclinical grouping of autism. And you can often see this in family members of diagnosed autistic people because it's so genetic. I was kind of like on the fence about that before I haven't had a formal diagnosis, I will be clear. I don't really want one. I've looked into it. I really thought about it for a long time, but the cost is so high and it's so obvious for me that it's not anything that I really need to have in writing. I also had an autism coach who is a licensed therapist and like was like, yes, dear, yes, you are. So even without that, but before all of that, I was reading about the broader autism phenotype and like kind of like, oh, I don't want to be just that. Like I'm autistic, and now I'm really grateful for it because the more I learn about people, about, our brains and neurodivergence in general, like autism is just a word made up for these specific traits all lumped together in which you may have, many or a couple. And, and the diagnosis criteria, right? So it's just a made up thing. It's a container. Autism is just a container for people who experience life and like what they say they do. And for me, if I don't need a formal diagnosis for work, for school, for care, for insurance purposes, then it doesn't matter what it's called. It's only good to know that my brain functions in this way and that these things can be helpful and that I'm, this is the reason why I deal with social situations in this way, with sensory processing overload, with all of these things, right? It made my life make sense and it made me feel better. So it doesn't matter what it's called. It doesn't matter if I'd be clinically diagnosed or not. I know that I'm neurodivergent and that's been exceedingly helpful to me. And I think that is really what I'm trying to get across to people. Like, it's amazing to know how you work and that you're not broken and that, there are things maybe challenging for you that you can learn how to help yourself with, and that there are things that you are going to be able to do so much more easily than other people, which I think is awesome. So whether you're clinically diagnosable or not, it really doesn't matter to me. And there is that subclinical classification if you're looking for it. I talked a bit about why it could be helpful to get your kids diagnosed, and I'm just going to add a little bit to that here. There are a lot of interventions and state-funded interventions for kids who are diagnosed early. Your state is going to differ probably, but like you can look into that if your kid has a diagnosis early. And at school, obviously they can have individualized support. They can have whatever they need will be looked at and hopefully given to you without a problem. So that can be really good too. I think it's also really nice to know, just like from when I was young, it's good to know like your brain just works differently. You can tell your kids all about it without using the word if you want, without using autism. I just heard today, I can't believe I didn't know this, orchid children. It's maybe a non-stigmatized way to teach your kid that they can be different than other people and not wrong, not broken. And obviously there's like just more ways you can advocate for your kid and that they can learn to advocate for themselves. They can learn those self-regulation techniques early. It can help prevent some meltdowns and some shutdowns. And it can just really set them up with a stronger mental base, more self-esteem, if they know how to help themselves when they're overstimulated, how to prevent themselves from becoming overstimulated, how to work with their own system, how to become more in touch with their bodies so that they understand what's going on, and how to, and I just see this a lot, right? Like, especially, if you're brought up through ABA, through behavioral analysis, and you're constantly taught to be different than your instincts tell you to be, man, does that leave the door open for manipulation, for grooming, for sexual assault, especially young girls, right? Who are also already taught to give power over to adults. And so just be careful of that, right? We want our kids and ourselves to know that we are autonomous beings and that how we feel matters, even when what we do and how we feel is different from others, right? So instead of trying to like corral our kids into being neurotypical, being able to sit still all the time and listen and do as we're told, that might not be the best way to raise neurodivergent kids, because we need them to feel that autonomy and that how they feel and their instincts really do matter. Again, if there's self-harm involved, it's a different situation. So, all right, this is a very long episode, but I hope you understand what I was trying to get across, and that there is immense amount of empowerment and reducing shame and like springboarding that can happen when you learn to understand yourself. And if you happen to be neurodivergent, it's just, I would think, necessary, right? To help you thrive, help you live in the best way, help you get as much enjoyment and success out of your life as you want to. And if you can help your kids with that early on, again, whether you get a formal diagnosis or not, whether they're, clinically, reaching that threshold or not, if you can tell that they are super sensitive kids, that they have, other criteria that could be in the broader autistic phenotype even, and you can just empower them with these techniques of self-regulation and empowering themselves to listen to their bodies and their instincts and all of that stuff, I just think we can raise kids that really know who they are, and that is so good for them. So I'm going to end it here. And I really hope that you enjoyed this. Let me know what your experiences were, what your experiences are. Are you a late diagnosed adult? Are you an undiagnosed adult? Do you have kids who you think might be on the spectrum or just, below? Could they be in use of some of these techniques that we now have? Okay, I'm going to shut up. Lots of love. Bye.